I thought my grandfather's final gift would secure my future. Instead, it sparked a ruthless family betrayal. As my parents secretly schemed to steal my $40 million mansion, they had no idea I was about to uncover a secret that would change everything. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. My name is Nia. I am 28 years old and I work as an architectural appraiser and historian. I grew up in the affluent neighborhoods of Buckhead in Atlanta, Georgia. To the outside world, my family represented the pinnacle of Black excellence. We were the people you saw on the covers of local society magazines, hosting charity dinners, and attending exclusive country club galas. But behind the manicured lawns and the perfectly tailored designer suits, my family was a toxic web of debt deceit and desperate social climbing. I was always the outsider, the daughter who cared more about preserving our actual heritage than buying another luxury car to impress strangers. My grandfather Isaiah was a self-made real estate titan who understood the value of hard work. When he passed away, he left his crown jewel, a sprawling historic estate known as Legacy Manor, entirely to me. He knew I was the only one who would not immediately sell it to fund a superficial lifestyle. Tonight was the annual Atlanta Heritage Foundation Gala, a highly publicized event packed with 500 of the city's wealthiest and most influential residents. The ballroom of the luxury hotel was a sea of sparkling chandeliers, expensive champagne, and silk evening gowns. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the quiet hum of networking. I stood near the back of the room nursing a glass of sparkling water, watching my family work the crowd. My father Roland, a financial advisor whose outward charm masked a mountain of bad investments, was laughing loudly with a group of local politicians. My mother Valerie was adjusting her diamond necklace while posing for a photographer. My older sister Chloe, the undisputed golden child of the family, was clinging to the arm of her husband Andre. Andre was a sports agent who wore suits that were a little too flashy and smiled a little too widely. He was a man drowning in gambling debts, though the family constantly bent over backward to cover his tracks and protect his image. I watched as my mother signaled to the string quartet to stop playing. She gracefully climbed the steps to the main stage, tapping a silver spoon against her crystal champagne flute. The gentle ringing sound brought the massive ballroom to a hush. Every eye turned toward Valerie. She offered a practiced, mournful smile to the crowd, placing one hand delicately over her heart. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I knew that look. It was the exact expression she used right before she played the ultimate martyr. "Thank you all for being here tonight to support such a wonderful cause." My mother began, her voice echoing through the state-of-the-art sound system. Her tone was dripping with fake sorrow. As many of you know, our family recently lost our patriarch, my beloved father Isaiah. He left behind a magnificent legacy, both in his spirit and in his properties. One of those properties is the historic Legacy Manor. She paused, letting a single perfectly timed tear escape and roll down her cheek. The audience murmured in collective sympathy. "It breaks my heart to make this announcement," my mother continued, her voice trembling, just enough to be convincing. "But family must always protect family. My youngest daughter, Nia, has unfortunately found herself drowning in massive, insurmountable business debts. She has made some terrible choices, and the financial ruin is threatening to destroy her completely. Therefore, Roland and I have made the agonizing decision to step in. We are sacrificing our own heritage to save her. We will be selling Legacy Manor immediately to cover Nia's reckless mistakes and save her from federal bankruptcy." A collective gasp ripped through the ballroom. 500 pairs of eyes shifted from the stage to search the room, looking for the disgraced daughter. The humiliation was designed to be absolute and crushing. My mother had just publicly branded me a financial failure and a reckless burden in front of every major client partner and socialite in Atlanta. She was using my supposed incompetence as a smokescreen to sell the $40 million estate my grandfather had entrusted to me. She was trying to force my hand through public shame. Before I could even process the sheer audacity of her lie, I felt a heavy hand clamp down hard on my shoulder. I was roughly pulled into the shadows behind a massive marble pillar out of sight from the main crowd. It was Andre. My brother-in-law loomed over me, his cologne smelling sharply of desperation and expensive whiskey. His eyes were wide and manic. He shoved a heavy gold-plated pen and a thick legal document directly into my chest. "Sign it right now." Andre hissed, his voice a low, threatening growl. He pressed the paper against the marble pillar, blocking my only exit. "It is a power of attorney. It gives your father full legal rights to negotiate the sale of the manor. Sign the damn paper, Nia, and do not make your mother cry anymore in front of these people. Do not embarrass this family any further than you already have." I looked down at the document, and then I looked up into Andre's panicked eyes. "I am an architectural appraiser. I deal with legal property documents every single day. I also know exactly how to read a room." My parents did not care about my business, which was actually thriving and completely debt-free. They cared about the millions of dollars Andre owed to illegal sports bookies. They were going to steal my $40 million inheritance, sell it to the highest bidder, and use the cash to bail out their golden child's husband from his own catastrophic gambling addiction. They were willing to destroy my entire reputation to save his. I looked at the pen in his hand, and a profound icy calm washed over me. I did not cry. I did not shake. I simply pushed his heavy arm away with a steady, forceful movement that caught him completely off guard. "You are sweating, Andre," I said softly, looking at the beads of perspiration on his forehead. "And you are holding a worthless piece of paper." Before he could process my words or try to grab me again, I stepped out from behind the marble pillar. I walked with purpose, my heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. The crowd parted for me, their whispers buzzing like a hive of angry bees. My mother was still on the stage, wiping her fake tears with a silk handkerchief. My father stood near the front row, looking incredibly smug. He thought the public pressure had broken me. He thought I was walking up to the stage to apologize and accept their generous rescue. I climbed the steps to the stage. My mother offered me a look of deep theatrical pity and held out the microphone. I took it from her hand. The heavy metal felt cool and solid against my palm. I turned to face the sea of Atlanta's elite. I made eye contact with the local politicians, the wealthy investors, and the gossiping socialites. Then I looked directly down at my father. "I am incredibly moved by my mother's speech," I said, my voice projecting loud and crystal clear across the silent ballroom. "It takes a remarkable amount of creativity to stand in front of 500 people and invent a story so completely detached from reality." My mother's smile instantly vanished. She reached out to grab my arm, but I smoothly stepped away, keeping the microphone close to my mouth. "I do not have any business debt." I continued enunciating every single word. "My appraisal firm is highly profitable and completely debt-free. What my family neglected to mention is that the debts they are so desperate to cover belong entirely to my brother-in-law, Andre, who has gambled away millions. They intended to steal Legacy Manor tonight by forcing me to sign a power of attorney under public duress." The ballroom erupted into chaotic murmurs. People were whispering frantically, pointing at Andre, who was now shrinking back into the shadows. My father's face turned a violent shade of purple. He took a step toward the stage, his fists clenched at his sides. "But I am afraid their grand sacrifice is completely unnecessary," I announced, raising my voice over the growing noise of the crowd. "You see, a power of attorney cannot sell a property that an individual no longer owns. At 9 o'clock this morning, I permanently transferred the deed of Legacy Manor into an impenetrable, irrevocable blind trust. I am the sole trustee, and the property can never be sold, mortgaged, or leveraged by anyone in this family. The house is locked down forever." The silence that followed was absolute and deafening. I turned to look at my mother. Her flawless makeup could not hide the sheer, unadulterated terror spreading across her features. She looked like she had just seen a ghost. The $40 million safety net she had planned to steal had just vanished into thin air, taking her social standing and her financial salvation with it. Down in the front row, the sharp, violent sound of shattering glass cut through the quiet. My father had gripped his crystal champagne flute so tightly that it exploded in his hand. Champagne and blood dripped onto the pristine white tablecloth, but he did not even seem to notice. He just stared at me with pure, unmasked hatred. I set the microphone down gently on the wooden podium. I did not wait for security. I did not wait for the inevitable screaming match. I simply walked down the stairs, cutting a path through the stunned crowd of Atlanta's highest society, and headed straight for the exit doors. As I pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped out into the cool, refreshing night air, my phone buzzed in my clutch. I pulled it out and looked at the glowing screen. It was a secure text message from Desmond, the ruthless and fiercely loyal lawyer who managed my grandfather's trust. The message was short, but it sent a surge of adrenaline straight to my heart. Your grandfather knew they would try to steal it. He recorded all of their financial crimes before he died. Get to the house tonight. Bypass the security alarm. Go down to the wine cellar and find the black book. The real war starts now. Desmond's text message burned into my retinas. The sheer panic on my parents' faces back in that ballroom was the culmination of a war that had been silently raging behind closed doors. To truly understand how we reached this point of public annihilation, you have to rewind exactly 3 weeks. 3 weeks ago, the impenetrable illusion of my family's supremacy began to fracture inside Desmond's mahogany-paneled law office. We had gathered for the official reading of my grandfather Isaiah's will. The atmosphere in the room was thick with unspoken greed and arrogant anticipation. My father Roland sat at the heavy oak conference table, leaning back in his tailored Italian suit. He looked less like a grieving son and more like a king waiting for his long-overdue coronation. Next to him, my mother Valerie wore a black designer dress that looked like it belonged on a Paris runway, rather than at a legal proceeding for the deceased. My sister Chloe and her husband Andre whispered excitedly, pulling up fabric swatches on an iPad to plan renovations for the estate they assumed was theirs. They were already mentally spending millions of dollars they had not yet received, completely oblivious to the impending disaster. I sat quietly at the opposite end of the table, dressed in a simple tailored blazer, my hands folded neatly in my lap. I was the only one in the room actually mourning the loss of the greatest man I had ever known. Desmond, a sharp, unsmiling attorney who had been my grandfather's most trusted confidant for 2 decades, sat meticulously arranging his paperwork. He adjusted his glasses and looked around the room with an expression of barely concealed disdain for my parents. He cleared his throat and began reading the legal document that would destroy their entire world. Desmond read the minor bequests first. To my father, Isaiah left his collection of vintage timepieces and a modest cash sum. To my mother, he left stern advice about finding humility. To Chloe, he left our late grandmother's collection of pearls. The tension in the room skyrocketed as Desmond reached the final, most crucial section of the will: the disposition of Legacy Manor. The sprawling $40 million estate was the crown jewel of Isaiah's real estate empire. My father sat forward, an expectant smile spreading across his face as he prepared to claim his prize. Desmond looked directly at my father and read the final clause with brutal clarity. Isaiah's words echoed through the room. Legacy Manor is a testament to Black survival excellence and history. It is not a bank account to be raided by those who lack the discipline to build their own wealth. Therefore, I leave the estate, its grounds, and all its contents entirely and exclusively to my youngest granddaughter, Nia. She is the only person in this room who understands the true value of our heritage. The gravity of those words hung heavily in the air, shifting the entire power dynamic of our family in an instant. The mahogany-paneled office plunged into a suffocating, dead silence. My father's smug smile instantly vanished, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated shock. My mother dropped her designer handbag onto the hardwood floor with a loud thud. But it was Chloe who reacted first. My poised, socially obsessed older sister let out a feral sound. Her face twisted into a mask of pure rage. She shrieked that it was a mistake, that I must have manipulated a sick, dying old man to steal her rightful inheritance. Before my father could calm her, Chloe slammed her hands on the table, lunged across the polished wood, and tried to attack me. She reached out her manicured nails aimed right for my face, screaming that I was nothing but a jealous, worthless loser. I did not even flinch. Before her hands could graze my skin, Desmond's private security detail stepped out of the shadows. Two massive men in dark suits grabbed Chloe by the arms, effortlessly lifting her off the table and shoving her forcefully back into her leather chair. Desmond slammed his fist down on the desk, his voice booming with absolute authority. He warned them that any further aggressive outbursts would result in immediate removal from the premises and criminal assault charges. The will was ironclad, impenetrable, and legally binding. There was absolutely no room for negotiation or legal maneuvering, and my family knew they had been completely outplayed by a dead man. Realizing that physical intimidation and screaming would not work against Desmond's legal fortress, my parents immediately shifted their strategy. They pivoted to the one weapon they had successfully used against me my entire life: psychological manipulation. Later that same night, I was sitting alone in my apartment when my parents showed up unannounced. They did not come with anger. They came with fake tears and a carefully crafted performance of parental concern. My mother immediately collapsed onto my sofa, burying her face in her hands and sobbing hysterically. My father paced the floor, playing the weary, desperate patriarch trying to save his family from utter ruin. He knelt in front of me, his eyes wide with manufactured terror. He claimed my grandfather was deeply confused in his final months, hiding terrible secrets. Then he delivered the lie they had fabricated. He claimed that Legacy Manor was a cursed asset, burdened with a hidden $5 million federal tax lien that my grandfather had accrued through illegal business dealings. My father grabbed my hands, begging me to listen. He said that if I kept the deed registered in my name, the Internal Revenue Service would immediately audit my appraisal firm, seize all my personal assets, and inevitably send me to federal prison for felony tax evasion. My mother wailed from the sofa, begging me not to destroy my life over an old house. The trap was set. My father pulled a pre-drafted deed transfer document from his briefcase. He told me that if I quietly signed the mansion over to his anonymous corporate shell company, he could use his elite political connections to absorb the debt, shield me from the federal government, and handle the legal fallout behind closed doors. They framed their attempted theft as the ultimate act of parental sacrifice. They expected me to be the naive, easily manipulated scapegoat they had always trained me to be. I looked at the paperwork, then at their tear-stained faces, and I told them I needed 24 hours to pray and think about it. I promised I would make the right decision for the family, putting on my own flawless performance to get them out of my home. As soon as the door clicked shut behind them, my demeanor shifted from feigned anxiety to ice-cold determination. My parents had severely underestimated who they were dealing with. I am a professional architectural appraiser and historian. My entire career is built on investigating property lineages, authenticating historical deeds, and uncovering hidden real estate liabilities. I do not panic over real estate threats. I verify them. I walked straight to my home office, booted up my computer, and bypassed the public search portals, logging directly into the secure Fulton County property tax database, using my professional credentials. I pulled up the comprehensive tax history for Legacy Manor. It took me less than 3 minutes to uncover the truth. There was absolutely no hidden tax lien. In fact, my grandfather had prepaid the property taxes in full for the next 10 years before he died. The estate was completely unencumbered and financially pristine. My parents had looked me dead in the eye and lied about a federal investigation just to terrify me into surrendering $40 million. But my professional instincts told me to keep digging. I navigated to the secondary title registry, searching for any recent encumbrances or strange legal filings attached to the property's address. What I found made my blood run entirely cold. Hidden deep in the digital registry was a secondary loan document, quietly filed just weeks before my grandfather passed away. The loan was for $3 million, and it was tied directly to my father's corporate shell company. I pulled up the digitized scan of the original document and zoomed in on the signature line. There, in shaky, forced ink, was my grandfather Isaiah's signature authorizing the loan against his own property. But I knew my grandfather's handwriting better than anyone. I looked at the date stamp on the document. The signature was dated 2 full days after my grandfather had slipped into an irreversible medically induced coma. It was a blatant, sloppy forgery. My father had not just lied to me about a tax lien. He had committed massive financial fraud against his own dying father. And now, standing in the silence of my office, I held the undeniable digital proof that could send my own flesh and blood to federal prison for a very long time. 2 days after discovering the forged signature, I officially moved my entire life into Legacy Manor. I did not give my parents the courtesy of a phone call to decline their manipulative offer. I simply packed my bags, hired a private moving company, and took physical possession of my grandfather's estate. The manor stood as a magnificent testament to Black architectural brilliance, a sprawling Tudor Revival property nestled behind towering wrought iron gates in the most exclusive zip code in Buckhead. Walking through the grand mahogany doors, I felt the heavy protective presence of my grandfather surrounding me. But I also knew my silence was deafening to my family. By ignoring my father's forged tax lien trap, I had fired the first warning shot. The gaslighting phase was officially over. My family realized I was not the gullible scapegoat they could bully into submission. Their desperate need for the $40 million asset meant they had to pivot rapidly from emotional manipulation to outright intimidation. My mother, Valerie, was a master of high society social warfare. If she could not control me privately, she would ensure I was destroyed publicly. Within 48 hours of my move, my phone began flooding with messages from concerned acquaintances. My mother had activated her vast, ruthless network within the Atlanta Black elite. Through hushed whispers at country club luncheons and frantic text chains in her Jack and Jill chapters, Valerie painted a tragic, horrifying picture of her youngest daughter. The narrative she spun was vicious and calculated to perfection. She told everyone that my grandfather's death had triggered a severe psychotic break. She claimed I was suffering from grief-induced mania, barricading myself inside Legacy Manor and violently refusing psychiatric help. She sat sipping mimosas with the city's wealthiest wives, wiping away fake tears as she told them I was destroying the historic estate from the inside out. She told her influential friends that my father was fighting a heartbreaking legal battle to save me from myself. She was laying the legal and social groundwork to have me declared incompetent. It was a brilliant evil strategy. If society believed I was crazy, no one would question it when my family inevitably seized control of the trust. But I refused to play into her hands. I did not issue frantic denials or post angry rants on social media defending my sanity. I simply locked the iron gates, fortified my grandfather's files, and waited for their next move. I knew the physical attack was coming. I just did not expect it to happen under the cover of total darkness. It happened on my third night in the mansion. The estate was dead silent, carrying the kind of heavy, suffocating quiet that only exists in massive, empty houses. At exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, the central air conditioning unit abruptly cut off. The low hum of the kitchen refrigerator died. The heavy antique lamps flickered once before plunging the entire estate into pitch-black darkness. I sat up in bed, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. I reached for the bedside lamp, but the switch clicked uselessly. I grabbed my cell phone and turned on the flashlight, sweeping the bright beam across the master suite. I walked to the ensuite bathroom and turned the polished brass faucet. A single muddy drop of water fell before the pipes let out a hollow, rattling groan. The power grid had not failed. The main breakers and the municipal water lines had been intentionally severed from the outside. Before I could fully process the utility blackout, the aggressive crunch of heavy tires on gravel shattered the silence of the estate. I rushed to the master bedroom window and peered through the heavy velvet curtains. 3 unmarked battered diesel trucks had breached the front gate and were idling aggressively in the circular driveway. Their high beams cut harshly through the darkness, illuminating the grand brick facade of Legacy Manor. The doors of the trucks swung open, and a dozen men poured out into the cool night air. They were not wearing official uniforms or carrying legitimate work orders. They carried heavy steel sledgehammers, iron crowbars, and industrial demolition equipment. Leading the pack was my brother-in-law, Andre. He wore a designer leather jacket and a smug, predatory grin, pointing his hired men directly toward the ornate double front doors. They did not bother to knock. They took a crowbar to the vintage brass lock, splintering the heavy mahogany wood with a sickening, violent crack. The front doors burst open, and the sound of heavy work boots echoed menacingly through the marble foyer. I did not cower in the bedroom. I slipped on my shoes, grabbed a heavy brass flashlight from the nightstand, and marched straight down the sweeping grand staircase. Andre stood in the center of the foyer, barking loud orders at the sketchy contractors. They were fanning out across the ground floor, their sledgehammers raised and ready. Andre turned and spotted me standing on the stairs. His smile widened into a mask of pure malice. "Good morning, Nia," he shouted over the noise, his voice dripping with intense condescension. "Your father sent us over." He noticed the house was looking a little outdated, so he hired my crew to do some emergency renovations. "We are just here to spruce the place up for you." Before I could order them out of my house, Andre snapped his fingers. On his immediate command, a massive contractor swung a 20-pound sledgehammer directly into the parlor wall. The impact sounded like an explosion. Plaster dust rained down as the heavy steel obliterated a section of original Venetian plaster, and the hand-carved crown molding my grandfather had meticulously preserved for decades. As an architectural appraiser, the destruction was like a physical blow to my chest. They were not just breaking walls. They were destroying a priceless piece of Black history specifically to break my spirit. Andre watched my eyes widen as another contractor took a crowbar to the custom oak paneling in the hallway, ripping the expensive wood from the studs. They were employing classic psychological warfare, attempting to terrorize me into fleeing the property in the middle of the night. "Stop right now," I commanded, my voice projecting clearly through the thick, dusty air. "You are trespassing on private property and you are committing felony destruction of a historic site. I am calling the police." Andre laughed, a harsh grating sound that bounced off the ruined walls. He casually strolled toward me, waving away the contractor near the hallway. He backed me slowly into the massive, darkened kitchen. The moonlight filtering through the large windows cast long, sinister shadows across the marble countertops. His men continued smashing the parlor walls in the other room. The rhythmic, violent thuds successfully drowned out any chance of me screaming for help. Andre cornered me against the industrial stainless steel refrigerator. The smell of his expensive cologne mixed heavily with the acrid scent of plaster dust and pure aggression. He leaned in uncomfortably close, his physical presence designed to intimidate, to remind me that I was a woman alone in a dark, isolated mansion surrounded by violent men. "Go ahead and call the police," Nia, Andre whispered, his voice completely dropping the playful facade and revealing the desperate, dangerous man underneath. "By the time they get out here, this entire floor will be completely gutted. Your father has the local precinct in his pocket anyway. They will just see a family dispute over a renovation project gone wrong. No one is going to help the crazy sister who is having a psychotic break." He placed his heavy hands on the counter on either side of me, effectively trapping me in the dark. His eyes were wide and bloodshot with the intense stress of his massive gambling debts. He pulled a folded legal document from his jacket pocket and slammed it hard onto the marble island. "This ends tonight," Andre hissed, his breath hot and erratic against my face. "Your little stunt at the gala humiliated Valerie, and it cost me a lot of time I do not have to spare. Sign the house over to Roland right now. I will wire $1 million into your account by tomorrow morning. You take the money, you walk away, and you live a nice, quiet life. But if you do not sign it, Nia, I swear to God you do not make it out of this kitchen." My heart raced, but the paralyzing panic that Andre fully expected to see never materialized. My hands rested calmly on the cool marble counter. I slowly crossed my arms, bringing my left wrist slightly closer to his chest. He thought I was trembling with fear, shrinking away from his threat. but my fingers were perfectly steady as I subtly tapped the face of my smartwatch twice. The tiny, imperceptible vibration against my skin confirmed that the high-definition audio recording application had successfully engaged. I was capturing every single word of his felony extortion, his admission of property destruction, and his explicit death threat in crystal-clear audio. I looked him dead in the eye and offered a slow, deliberate smile. The kind of smile that made his arrogant expression falter for just a fraction of a second. I did not scream. I did not beg. I simply stared at him with the cold calculation of someone who already held the winning hand. "Your contractors are making a lot of noise," I said, keeping my voice perfectly even. "But they are missing the structural load-bearing walls. If you really wanted to bring the house down on top of me, you should have hired better professionals. Now get out of my house before I demonstrate exactly how a psychotic break looks." Andre scoffed, trying to regain his dominant posture, but the damage was done. He had expected a terrified victim, not a woman critiquing his demolition strategy. He shoved away from the marble counter, pointing a warning finger at my face. "You have 24 hours to sign that deed," he snarled. "After that, the gloves come off." He stormed out of the kitchen, shouting orders at his crew of thugs. Within minutes, the heavy boots retreated. The diesel engines roared to life and the truck sped away down the gravel driveway, leaving me alone in the suffocating darkness of the vandalized estate. I exhaled a long, steady breath. My hands finally began to tremble, the adrenaline crashing through my system. But I did not have time to indulge in fear. The threat was real and the clock was ticking. I retrieved a high-powered battery lantern from the emergency kit in the pantry and began my assessment. Walking through the grand parlor, the devastation was sickening. As a professional architectural appraiser, I did not just see broken walls. I saw the precise financial and historical value of every shattered artifact. My mind automatically cataloged the destruction for the felony police report I was preparing to file. They had pulverized a section of hand-carved mahogany wainscoting imported from France in the 1920s. Replacement value $85,000. The custom stained glass transom window above the library doors lay in colorful, glittering shards across the Persian rug. Valuation $120,000. The original Venetian plaster they had sledgehammered to dust would require specialized artisans to recreate, adding another $40,000 to the damages. In less than 20 minutes, Andre and his hired thugs had caused $250,000 in property damage. It was more than enough to trigger federal destruction of property charges, elevating his midnight intimidation tactic from a local misdemeanor to a serious federal crime. But I needed to check the foundation. If they had compromised the structural integrity of the lower levels, the house could be genuinely unsafe. I made my way toward the basement door, the heavy beam of my lantern slicing through the settling plaster dust. The wooden stairs groaned under my weight as I descended into the cavernous, unfinished lower level. The air down here was damp and heavy with the scent of aged stone and earth. I swept the light across the concrete foundation walls, checking for stress fractures or fresh damage. My lantern beam hit the far corner of the basement, revealing a section of original brickwork that had been violently smashed. Andre's crew must have started down here first, likely searching for a main structural support to weaken. They had abandoned the effort, leaving a gaping, jagged hole in the century-old masonry. I walked closer to inspect the damage, shining the light directly into the dark void they had created behind the brick. The beam caught the glint of brushed steel. I froze, stepping closer and peering through the broken rubble. Behind the false brick wall sat a heavy industrial-grade steel door. It was not a standard basement fixture. It looked like the entrance to a bank vault, seamlessly integrated into the foundation of the house. I squeezed my hand through the opening, feeling the cold, smooth metal. My grandfather was a brilliant, secretive man, but this was a level of paranoia I had never witnessed. I grabbed an iron crowbar left behind by one of the thugs and began chipping away the remaining loose bricks, widening the hole until I could step through. The steel door was imposing, featuring no handle, no keyhole, and no keypad. The only interface was a small, sleek black glass square embedded at eye level, a biometric scanner. My grandfather had restricted access to this room using fingerprint or retinal identification, a dead end for anyone else. But my grandfather was a man of analog traditions, not just modern technology. He never trusted digital systems entirely without a physical override. I remembered the text message from Desmond. Find the black book. Desmond knew I could get inside, but how? I looked down at my right hand. On my index finger rested a heavy vintage gold signet ring. My grandfather had given it to me on my 18th birthday. It bore the family crest, a stylized oak tree. He had told me to never take it off, claiming it was the key to my future. I had always assumed he meant it metaphorically. I held the ring up to the beam of the lantern, examining the intricate engraving. The center of the oak tree was set with a flat, dark, onyx stone. I pressed the onyx face directly against the biometric glass scanner. The machine beeped a sharp electronic chirp that echoed in the silent basement. The glass panel glowed green. Heavy motorized deadbolts retracted with a loud, satisfying clunk, echoing like a heartbeat in the dark. The massive steel door swung open on silent, well-oiled hinges. I stepped over the threshold, shining my lantern into the hidden chamber. The air inside was perfectly climate-controlled, smelling faintly of cedar and aged paper. It was a secret wine cellar, meticulously organized with floor-to-ceiling mahogany racks holding hundreds of rare, dust-covered bottles. But the wine was merely a decorative disguise. In the very center of the room sat a solid oak desk illuminated by a single battery-operated desk lamp that had automatically flickered on when the vault door opened. Resting perfectly in the center of the desk was a thick, leather-bound ledger, the Black Book. I walked slowly toward the desk, the magnitude of the moment pressing heavily on my shoulders. This was my grandfather's insurance policy. This was the weapon he had spent years forging to protect his legacy from the greed of his own blood. I set my lantern down and pulled the heavy leather chair out, taking a seat at the desk. I opened the thick cover of the ledger, turning to the first meticulously handwritten page. The sheer volume of financial data was staggering. My grandfather had not just recorded family expenses. He had hired forensic accountants to track every single transaction, every hidden bank account, and every offshore wire transfer linked to my parents and Chloe's husband. As I turned the pages, the pristine, untouchable image of Atlanta's elite black society began to violently unravel before my eyes. I turned to the section labeled Roland. My father, the esteemed financial advisor, the man who stood on charity stages and judged the rest of the world, was a complete fraud. The ledgers detailed a massive decade-long embezzlement scheme. Roland had been systematically skimming millions of dollars from the retirement portfolios of his most vulnerable elderly clients. He had funneled the stolen cash through a complex network of shell companies, using the money to maintain his lavish country club lifestyle and cover catastrophic losses in the stock market. If this information reached the Securities and Exchange Commission, my father would not just be ruined professionally. He would be facing decades in a federal penitentiary. But the corruption did not stop there. I flipped the heavy parchment pages until I reached the section dedicated to Valerie and Andre. What I saw made my breath catch in my throat. My parents resided in a magnificent $5 million mansion in the neighboring suburb, a symbol of their supposed generational wealth. According to the documents in front of me, that house was entirely built on quicksand. The ledgers included copies of clandestine mortgage agreements. My parents had secretly leveraged their $5 million estate 3 separate times. They had drained every single cent of equity out of the property. But the money had not gone toward business investments or charity. It had gone straight to Andre. The records detailed explosive, devastating wire transfers from my parents' accounts directly to offshore gambling syndicates. Andre, the flashy sports agent, owed millions to illegal sports bookies. My parents had sacrificed their entire financial foundation, effectively bankrupting themselves in secret, just to keep their golden child's husband from having his legs broken by loan sharks. The truth sat heavy and undeniable in my hands. The desperate, frantic attempt to steal Legacy Manor was not driven by greed alone. It was driven by sheer, unadulterated terror. The illegal bookies were likely closing in on Andre. My father's embezzlement scheme was on the verge of collapsing. They needed the $40 million estate to bail themselves out of a catastrophic financial and legal apocalypse. They were perfectly willing to destroy my life, my reputation, and my future to save their own skin. I closed the heavy leather cover of the black book. The cool, quiet air of the hidden vault felt different now. It felt like an armory, and I had just been handed the most destructive weapon in the room. They thought I was a vulnerable, isolated woman they could terrorize in the dark. They thought breaking my walls and shutting off my power would force me into submission. They had no idea they had just handed me the exact coordinates to drop a nuclear bomb on their entire existence. I slipped the heavy ledger into my canvas tote bag, the weight of the evidence securing my resolve. I picked up the brass lantern and walked out of the secret cellar, watching the heavy steel door lock automatically behind me. The darkness of the basement no longer felt intimidating. It felt like the perfect cover for the war I was about to wage. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket. The screen illuminated the dark stairwell as I drafted a new encrypted message to Desmond. I found the book. The destruction stops today. We are not just defending the estate anymore. We are buying their debt. We are going on the offensive. Prepare the LLC. I hit send, the digital swoosh confirming the message delivery. As I walked back upstairs into the vandalized foyer of my grandfather's mansion, a new dangerous kind of energy surged through my veins. The days of playing the obedient, discarded scapegoat were officially over. The hunted had just become the hunter, and I was going to systematically dismantle their entire empire brick by stolen brick. The next morning, the Atlanta skyline was obscured by a thick, oppressive fog, a fitting backdrop for the clandestine meeting I had arranged. I bypassed my usual spots in Buckhead, opting instead for a private, heavily secured conference room at a boutique wealth management firm in Midtown. A place where confidentiality was not just promised, it was a religion. Desmond arrived exactly at 8 o'clock, his tailored charcoal suit immaculate, his expression as unreadable as ever. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I unzipped my canvas tote bag and slid the heavy leather-bound black book across the polished glass table. Desmond stared at the ledger for a long moment before reaching out to touch the worn cover. He knew exactly what it was. My grandfather had told him about it, but Desmond had never seen it with his own eyes. I watched his stoic demeanor crack just a fraction as he opened the book and began scanning the meticulously handwritten pages. The color drained from his face as his eyes darted over the columns detailing my father's massive embezzlement scheme and the shocking transfer of millions to offshore gambling syndicates to cover my brother-in-law's debts. Desmond closed the book with a heavy sigh, removing his glasses and pinching the bridge of his nose. He looked at me, the weight of my family's depravity settling between us. He told me that Roland and Andre were not just reckless, they were radioactive. If these ledgers saw the light of day, the resulting federal indictments would destroy the family name permanently. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the cold glass table. I told him I did not care about the family name anymore. I only cared about neutralizing the threat they posed to my grandfather's legacy and my own life. I recounted the midnight siege, the sledgehammers, and Andre's explicit death threat in the dark of my kitchen. Desmond's jaw tightened. He asked if I wanted to hand the book over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation immediately and watch them all go to prison. I shook my head. Sending them to prison right now would trigger a chaotic, messy legal fallout that could tie up the estate for years. I needed to control the blast radius. I needed to own their destruction entirely. Desmond leaned back in his leather chair, a slow, predatory smile touching the corners of his mouth. He told me that my grandfather had anticipated this exact level of warfare. Isaiah knew that if the family ever found out they had been cut out of the will, they would stop at nothing to bleed me dry. That was why he did not just leave me a mansion. He left me a war chest. Desmond pulled a sleek, encrypted tablet from his briefcase and entered a lengthy alphanumeric passcode. He turned the screen toward me. It displayed a highly secure offshore trust account that I had never seen before. Attached to the deed of Legacy Manor was a hidden revolving line of credit, fully funded, completely untraceable, and exclusively under my control. The balance sitting in the account was $10 million. I stared at the screen, my mind racing as the magnitude of my grandfather's foresight washed over me. He had weaponized his wealth to protect me from beyond the grave. Desmond explained that the funds were intended for extreme emergencies, a fail-safe to buy off any threats or handle any catastrophic legal fees. I looked at the $10 million, then down at the black book containing my family's toxic liabilities. A cold, brilliant strategy crystallized in my mind. I told Desmond we were not going to use a single cent to pay off my family. We were going to play their wealthy cutthroat game, but we were going to play it better. I instructed Desmond to immediately establish an anonymous corporate shell company, a ghost LLC registered in Delaware, with zero public ties to my name or the estate. We would use the $10 million to aggressively purchase all of Roland and Andre's bad debts. We would not pay the debts off. We would buy the ownership of the debts from their shady creditors and greedy banks. I would become their ultimate invisible landlord. Desmond's eyes widened slightly as the sheer ruthlessness of the plan dawned on him. He warned me that buying illicit gambling debts from offshore bookies required navigating incredibly dangerous underworld channels. These syndicates were not gentlemen. They were ghosts who operated outside the law, communicating through burner phones and crypto wallets. I told him to hire the most aggressive, high-priced corporate fixers in Atlanta to act as intermediaries. We had the capital to make the brokers an offer they could not refuse. The execution of the plan was a masterclass in silent corporate warfare. Over the next 48 hours, my ghost LLC moved like a shadow through the financial underbelly of Atlanta. Desmond unleashed a team of ruthless financial negotiators who operated with military precision. They approached the underground syndicates holding Andre's massive sports betting markers. These were men who broke legs for a living, but even they preferred clean, immediate liquid cash over chasing a desperate, failing sports agent. Through our intermediaries, my LLC purchased Andre's markers at 80 cents on the dollar. The syndicate happily transferred the debt ownership, wiping their hands of the liability. In the span of a single afternoon, Andre no longer owed his life to violent bookies. He owed it entirely to the anonymous corporate entity I completely controlled. But I did not stop with Andre. We targeted the banks holding the multiple over-leveraged mortgages on my parents' $5 million estate. Roland had stretched his credit to the absolute breaking point, missing payments and utilizing fraudulent income statements to secure the loans. He had masked his failing financial health with fabricated tax returns, creating a house of cards that was already swaying in the wind. The banking executives were sweating under the pressure of looming federal audits. When Desmond's fixers approached them with a lucrative quiet buyout offer through the Ghost LLC, the banks practically tripped over themselves to offload the bad paper. We bought the primary mortgage, the secondary loans, and the massive home equity line of credit my parents had drained to fund their fake high society lifestyle. The banks transferred the deeds of trust without asking a single question about the true identity of the buyer. The efficiency of the transactions was intoxicating. I sat in my home office at Legacy Manor, surrounded by the shattered plaster and broken wood my brother-in-law had left behind, watching the digital confirmations roll into my secure inbox. I was systematically dismantling the very foundation of their elite existence, without ever showing my face. My parents were attending lavish charity luncheons and posing for society magazines, completely oblivious to the fact that the ground beneath their feet had just been sold to the daughter they had discarded. I was no longer the scapegoat. I was the silent, absolute master of their financial universe. I owned the roof over their heads, the cars in their driveway, and the very air they breathed. I needed to ensure the trap was inescapable. I directed Desmond to implement acceleration clauses into the debt transfers wherever legally permissible. If my parents or Andre missed even a fraction of a payment, or if any further fraudulent activity was detected, my LLC would have the immediate right to demand payment in full, or initiate instant foreclosure and asset seizure. We built a legal fortress around their liabilities, ensuring that no amount of political maneuvering or country club connections could save them from the impending ruin. Every single dollar they owed was now tied to a contract that I personally held in my secure safe. The power dynamic had completely inverted. For my entire life, my family had dictated my worth, controlling my access to love and resources based on my compliance with their toxic demands. Now their survival depended entirely on my mercy. And after the midnight raid on my home, my mercy was non-existent. I spent hours reviewing the final executed contracts, tracing the lines of legalese that officially transferred their miserable, desperate lives into my hands. The ink on the debt transfer documents was finally dry. The Ghost LLC was fully operational, and the $10 million war chest had been brilliantly deployed. I took a deep, satisfying breath, feeling a profound sense of peace settle over me for the first time since my grandfather's funeral. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water and walked through the grand foyer, ignoring the debris they had caused. My mind focused entirely on the beautiful destruction I was about to unleash upon them. Just as I took a sip of my water, a sharp, authoritative knock echoed from the heavy mahogany front doors. The sound was jarring, breaking the triumphant silence of the manor. I checked the security camera feed on my phone. Standing on the front porch was not a delivery driver or a lost neighbor. It was a man in a cheap, rumpled suit, holding a thick manila folder, a process server. I unlocked the reinforced deadbolts and pulled the heavy door open. The man did not smile. He simply asked to confirm my identity. When I nodded, he thrust the thick manila folder into my hands, stated that I had been officially served, and walked briskly back to his sedan. I closed the door and tore open the envelope, my eyes scanning the dense legal jargon printed on the first page. The air left my lungs in a sharp, sudden rush. It was an emergency petition filed with the Fulton County Superior Court. The petitioners listed at the top of the document were my mother, Valerie, and my sister, Chloe. They had not been sitting idle while I bought their debt. They had escalated their social smear campaign into a full-blown legal assault. The document in my hands was a formal request to place me under an immediate psychiatric conservatorship. They had submitted falsified affidavits, claiming I was a severe danger to myself and others suffering from a catastrophic violent mental breakdown. They had even attached fake witness statements from their high society friends, people who had never spoken to me, swearing under penalty of perjury that I was seen wandering the estate grounds, screaming at invisible threats. They were attempting to force me into an involuntary psychiatric hold to have me legally declared incompetent. If a judge granted this petition, I would be stripped of all my fundamental human rights. I would not be able to sign a contract, access my bank accounts, or make my own medical decisions. And most importantly, my mother and sister would be appointed as my legal guardians, granting them total unchecked control over Legacy Manor and my grandfather's entire trust. They were trying to lock me in a psychiatric ward to steal my $40 million estate. The battle for my fortune had just become a battle for my freedom. The battle for my fortune had just become a battle for my freedom. I stood in the foyer of Legacy Manor, clutching the manila folder that held the falsified psychiatric petition. My mother and sister had sworn under penalty of perjury that I was a violent danger to society. Their lie was a sloppy miscalculation. They assumed I would react with erratic hysteria. I walked slowly down the hallway to my office, tossed the heavy legal documents onto my desk, and immediately picked up my phone. A barrage of notifications from various social media platforms instantly flooded my screen. Chloe had not just filed court documents, she had aggressively taken her smear campaign to the digital masses. I opened Instagram and immediately clicked her profile. The screen illuminated with a recorded live stream she had posted just an hour ago. Chloe sat on the plush velvet sofa of our parents' estate, her face devoid of makeup, looking artfully disheveled. She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, performing the role of the heartbroken, deeply concerned older sister to absolute perfection, making sure the camera captured every single tear. Her audience of over 50,000 followers watched in real time as she spun her vicious web of deceit. "I never wanted to take this public," Chloe whimpered into the camera, her voice catching with manufactured grief. But my family is going through a devastating tragedy right now. My little sister Nia is suffering from a severe psychotic break. She has locked herself inside our late grandfather's historic estate and is violently destroying the property. She is hallucinating, paranoid, and refusing all medical help. We love her so much, and it is tearing our hearts out to see her destroy our grandfather's beautiful legacy. We are taking the necessary legal steps to get her the involuntary psychiatric help she desperately needs. Please pray for our family. I watched the video twice, marveling at her sociopathic ability to cry on command. She was mobilizing her affluent circle to create a tidal wave of public pressure. If she could convince the city of Atlanta that I was insane, the court would have no choice but to grant the conservatorship. She was trying me in the court of public opinion. But Chloe had made one critical error. She mistook my strategic silence for weakness. I closed the app and immediately forwarded the video to Desmond, instructing him to archive it for a future defamation lawsuit. Flashing red and blue police lights suddenly illuminated the towering iron front gates of Legacy Manor. They had arrived to enforce the mandatory 72-hour psychiatric hold. I did not barricade the doors. I did not scream or throw things. I calmly walked to the front gate and buzzed the officers onto the property. When they approached the front door, they clearly expected to find a raving, hysterical woman matching the description in the court petition. Instead, they found a perfectly groomed, articulate professional waiting for them in the foyer, with her coat and ID already in hand. I smiled warmly at the lead officer, extending my hands. I told them I understood they were just doing their jobs, and that I was fully prepared to cooperate with the mandatory psychiatric evaluation. Their shoulders visibly relaxed. They escorted me to a private upscale psychiatric facility in North Atlanta, a place favored by the city's wealthy elite. I was shown into a sterile but comfortable evaluation room. The court-appointed psychiatrist Dr. Eris Thorne entered a few minutes later. She was a no-nonsense woman with a sharp gaze who specialized in high-conflict estate disputes and wealthy family dynamics. She carried the thick petition my mother and sister had filed. She sat across from me, studying my calm demeanor with a hint of surprise. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting lightly on the cold metal table, refusing to give her any reason to doubt my absolute sanity. Dr. Thorne began the evaluation by asking standard baseline questions to assess my orientation to reality. I answered each question with clinical precision. She asked about my sleep schedule, my eating habits, and my emotional state following my grandfather's death. I spoke eloquently about the natural grieving process, ensuring my tone remained grounded and objective. Then she opened the manila folder and read the specific allegations my family had sworn to. She asked why my mother and sister would claim I was hallucinating and violently destroying the estate with sledgehammers. I offered Dr. Thorne a sad, knowing smile. I told her that money makes people do terrible, desperate things. I explained that I am a licensed architectural appraiser, and my entire career is built on meticulous observation and reality-based assessments. I told her that I had not destroyed any property, but my brother-in-law, Andre, had broken into the manor days earlier and caused massive damage in an attempt to intimidate me into surrendering the deed. I explained that I had already filed a felony property damage report, with the police providing her with the official case number to verify my claim. Dr. Thorne took careful, detailed notes, her initial professional skepticism rapidly shifting into a state of highly focused, undeniable intrigue. I knew that simply denying the allegations was not enough. I had to prove their motive for lying. I reached into my designer handbag and pulled out a neatly organized tabbed folder I had prepared before the police arrived. I slid the folder across the table toward Dr. Thorne. I told her I understood she had to evaluate my mental health, but I politely requested she also evaluate the financial health of the people trying to lock me in a psychiatric ward. Dr. Thorne opened the folder. Inside was a carefully curated selection of documents extracted directly from the Black Book. I had not included the criminal embezzlement records, as those were for the FBI, but I had included undeniable proof of my parents' impending financial ruin. I showed her the 3 separate over-leveraged mortgages on my parents' $5 million estate. I provided the documentation showing their home was actively entering foreclosure. I included the massive illicit gambling debts Andre had racked up. Finally, I showed her the copy of my grandfather's will highlighting the clause that left the $40 million estate entirely to me, completely bypassing my parents. I watched Dr. Thorne's eyes widen as she connected the dots. The picture was incredibly clear. I was not a woman suffering from a psychotic break. I was a wealthy heiress sitting on a $40 million gold mine, and my bankrupt, desperate family was using the mental health system to steal my assets and save themselves from absolute ruin. I told the doctor that my family did not want to cure me. They wanted to cage me so they could liquidate my grandfather's legacy. Dr. Thorne closed the folder, a look of profound disgust crossing her features. She assured me she had seen this exact brand of high society exploitation before. She officially concluded the evaluation right then and there, declaring me entirely competent, perfectly sane, and the victim of a malicious, fraudulent legal attack. The following morning, we stood before the judge in Fulton County Superior Court for the emergency conservatorship hearing. My mother and sister sat on the opposite side of the aisle wearing dark, somber dresses, ready to play the grieving family. They smiled confidently when the judge picked up his gavel. Their confidence shattered the moment the judge read Dr. Thorne's blistering psychiatric evaluation into the official record. The judge did not mince his words. He glared down from the bench with absolute fury, slamming his gavel with a crack that echoed through the courtroom. He immediately dismissed the conservatorship petition with extreme prejudice. He warned Valerie and Chloe that if they ever attempted to file another fraudulent, malicious petition in his courtroom, he would personally see them indicted for perjury and abuse of the legal system. My mother's face drained of all color, and Chloe physically recoiled in her seat, utterly humiliated. I walked out of the courtroom completely victorious, a free woman untouched by their poisonous trap. Desmond met me outside the courthouse and escorted me back to Legacy Manor. I stepped inside the grand foyer, locking the heavy doors behind me, relishing the profound silence of my untouchable fortress. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket to check my messages. There was a single newly delivered voicemail from my angry father, Roland. I pressed play and lifted the phone to my right ear. His voice was no longer composed or manipulative. It was unhinged, vibrating with a guttural, terrifying rage. "You think you won, Nia?" Roland snarled, his breath ragged and heavy. "You think you can take everything from us and just lock the door? You sign that property deed over to me right now, or I swear to God, I will personally drive over there and burn that entire house to the ground, with you trapped right inside it." The chilling finality of my father's words crackled through my earpiece. I sat in my parked car, the engine idling softly, and let the sheer magnitude of his desperation wash over me. Plan B was not a legal maneuver. It was a home invasion. Roland and Andre were backed into a fatal corner, stripped of their social armor, and running out of time before federal agents kicked down their doors. They believed I was the only obstacle standing between them and a $40 million escape route. They thought they were going to ambush a terrified woman alone in a massive estate. They were incredibly wrong. I did not call the police. I did not panic. I put my car in drive and calmly executed a tactical retreat to set the ultimate trap. I drove straight to Desmond's heavily fortified office building in Midtown. I parked my car in his private underground garage, ensuring it was completely hidden from the street. If my family sent someone to scout my location, they would assume I was locked in emergency meetings with my legal counsel, desperately trying to defend myself. I left my cell phone on Desmond's desk, effectively turning my digital footprint into a decoy. Then, I took Desmond's armored company vehicle and drove to a secure off-site security hub that my grandfather had established years ago. It was a small, nondescript office space leased under a dummy corporation. Inside, an entire wall was lined with high-definition monitors, broadcasting real-time encrypted surveillance footage from every single room hallway, an exterior angle of Legacy Manor. I sat in the ergonomic leather chair flanked by two of Desmond's top private security contractors and watched the monitors. The sun began to set over Atlanta, casting long, menacing shadows across the sprawling grounds of my estate. At exactly 8 o'clock in the evening, a matte black luxury transport van pulled up to the rear service entrance of the manor. The heavy iron gates had been intentionally left unlocked, a deliberate vulnerability I had authorized to invite the predators inside. The side doors of the van slid open. Roland, Valerie, Chloe, and Andre spilled out into the twilight. They were no longer dressed for country club luncheons. They wore dark, inconspicuous clothing, moving with frantic, jerky, paranoid energy. Andre carried a heavy canvas duffel bag. Roland held a sophisticated electronic lock-picking device, a tool clearly acquired from his shady underworld connections. He approached the reinforced steel service door. It took him less than 3 minutes to bypass the electronic keypad. The heavy door swung open, and my family crept into my home like common thieves. I watched them navigate the dimly lit service corridors through the infrared night vision cameras. They moved quickly toward the grand parlor and the formal dining room, the areas of the house where my grandfather kept his most prized possessions. My grandfather was not just a real estate titan. He was one of the most prolific collectors of black art in the American South. The walls of Legacy Manor were lined with original authenticated masterpieces. There were breathtaking canvases by Romare Bearden, striking visceral works by Jean-Michel Basquiat, and incredibly rare historical pieces by Jacob Lawrence. The collection was appraised at over $15 million. It was a cultural treasure trove that belonged in a museum, not in the hands of desperate criminals. My family did not come to reason with me. They came to pillage. Assuming I was still cowering at my lawyer's office, they immediately set to work. Andre unzipped the heavy canvas duffel bag and pulled out specialized art transportation tubes and protective wrapping materials. Valerie and Roland began frantically pulling paintings off the walls, treating priceless cultural artifacts like cheap pawnshop inventory. They were not stealing the art to keep it. They were organizing an impromptu, highly illegal whisper auction right inside my living room. A whisper auction is a clandestine black market event where stolen or highly contested assets are sold to anonymous international buyers for immediate, untraceable liquid cash. Roland had tapped into his darkest, most corrupt financial networks to assemble a buyer list on zero notice. These were not art enthusiasts. They were ruthless opportunists looking to exploit a distressed seller for pennies on the dollar. As Roland and Andre arranged the stolen paintings around the grand parlor, leaning millions of dollars of art against the antique furniture, my sister Chloe wandered into the frame of a different camera. She had slipped away from the heavy lifting and crept upstairs into the master suite. My grandfather had a hidden wall safe behind a portrait in the master dressing room. I watched in absolute disgust as Chloe used a specialized drill tool clearly provided by Andre to aggressively pry the safe open. She reached inside and pulled out a heavy velvet box. It contained our late grandmother's legendary diamond necklace, a bespoke multi-million-dollar piece of jewelry that had been in the family for decades. Chloe did not put the necklace in her pocket. She brazenly fastened it around her own neck, admiring her reflection in the antique vanity mirror. She was parading around my home wearing stolen diamonds, while her husband prepared to fence my cultural inheritance. At 9 o'clock sharp, the buyers began to arrive. They slipped through the compromised service door, escorted by Andre. There were 5 men in total, all wearing expensive suits that could not hide their dangerous predatory demeanors. One man, a notorious Russian oligarch known to international authorities for money laundering, immediately gravitated toward the Basquiat. Another buyer, a shadowy tech billionaire with a reputation for purchasing stolen artifacts, began aggressively examining the Romare Bearden pieces with a jeweler's loupe. The grand parlor of Legacy Manor, a space built on the sweat and brilliance of a self-made black patriarch, had been transformed into a sordid criminal bazaar. Roland stood in the center of the room, acting as the frantic auctioneer. The audio feed from the hidden microphones picked up every hushed, tense negotiation. Roland was sweating profusely, his voice sharp and desperate. He was offering the entire $15 million collection for a flat, non-negotiable fee of $5 million in untraceable cryptocurrency and offshore wire transfers. He needed the cash immediately to secure private transport out of the country before the federal indictments dropped. The Russian buyer smirked, recognizing Roland's absolute desperation. He knew Roland was a cornered animal with a ticking clock. The buyer slowly circled the room, tapping his expensive cane against the hardwood floor. He offered $4 million for the entire lot. Roland's face turned a violent shade of crimson. He began to argue, citing the authenticated value of the individual pieces, but Andrei stepped in. Andrei grabbed Roland by the shoulder, his grip punishingly tight. Andrei hissed that they did not have time to haggle over market value. The police could show up at any second. They needed the exit capital right now. I sat in the security hub, perfectly still, watching the criminal transaction unfold in high definition. The security contractors beside me shifted uncomfortably, waiting for my command to call the authorities. I raised my hand, signaling them to hold. We needed the financial transaction to cross the point of no return. We needed the felony wire fraud to be fully executed and digitally cemented. Andrei turned back to the Russian buyer. He extended his hand, his face a mask of sweaty, terrified relief. "We accept the offer," Andrei said, his voice echoing through my earpiece. $5 million. Wire the funds to the offshore account right now, and you can load the canvases into your vehicles. The Russian buyer nodded. He pulled out an encrypted satellite phone and typed a series of commands. Less than a minute later, Andrei's phone buzzed with an alert. Andrei pulled the device from his pocket, his eyes widening as he read the notification. The $5 million transfer had successfully cleared the international banking firewall. The money was sitting in the ghost account Roland had set up. The felony was complete. The trap was fully loaded. I leaned forward in my ergonomic leather chair, my eyes locked on the primary monitor displaying the grand foyer and the parlor. I pressed my finger against the secure comms button, linking me directly to the tactical security team positioned in stealth vehicles around the perimeter of Legacy Manor. "Execute the lockdown," I commanded, my voice cold, steady, and absolutely devoid of mercy. The response was instantaneous and catastrophic for everyone inside my home. I reached out and slammed my hand down on the large red emergency override button on the security console. Inside Legacy Manor, a piercing, deafening alarm siren shattered the quiet hum of the whisper auction. The opulent lighting system instantly cut out, replaced by harsh, flashing crimson emergency strobes. But the most terrifying sound was not the alarm. It was the heavy mechanical roar of the structural defense system. Thick, impenetrable plates of ballistic-grade steel slammed down over every single window and exterior door of the sprawling mansion. The steel shutters hit the windowsills with a violent, synchronized crash that shook the foundation of the house. The heavy mahogany front doors were instantly sealed behind a wall of reinforced titanium. On the monitors, absolute pandemonium erupted. The Russian buyer dropped his cane, drawing a concealed firearm from his jacket. The other buyers panicked, rushing toward the rear service doors, only to find them completely barricaded by solid steel. Chloe screamed, clutching the stolen diamond necklace around her throat, dropping to the floor in sheer terror. Valerie grabbed Roland, sobbing uncontrollably, as the flashing red lights illuminated their worst nightmare. Andrei sprinted toward the kitchen, slamming his fists desperately against the impenetrable steel shutters covering the windows. They were completely sealed inside a $40 million vault. There was no way out. The police were not coming to save them. The buyers realized they had been lured into a high-stakes trap, and they immediately turned their fury toward Roland and Andrei, their weapons drawn, and their eyes blazing with lethal intent. The buyers demanded their $5 million back, shouting that they had been set up by a desperate, dying family. I sat in the security hub, watching the beautiful, chaotic destruction of my family unfold on the glowing screens. The predators were finally locked in the cage, and I held the only key. The fallout from the Piedmont Heritage Country Club was immediate and catastrophic. Roland sat in the passenger seat of Valerie's idling luxury sedan, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold his smartphone. He wiped a thick layer of cold sweat from his forehead and barked orders at Andre over the encrypted line. There was no time left for legal maneuvering or high society gaslighting. The anonymous email had effectively nuked their reputation, and Roland knew the federal authorities would be freezing his bank accounts by dawn. They needed untraceable liquid cash right now, and the only remaining asset capable of providing that kind of capital was hanging on the walls of my grandfather's estate. Roland instructed Andre to contact his most ruthless underworld connections and assemble a buyer list for an immediate midnight whisper auction. They were going to liquidate Grandfather Isaiah's $15 million art collection directly out of the parlor. They assumed I was locked in a panicked marathon session with Desmond at his downtown law firm, desperately trying to manage the fallout of the court petition. They believed Legacy Manor was completely empty and vulnerable. They were fatally mistaken. At exactly 8 o'clock that evening, an unmarked matte black transport van rolled to a halt near the rear service entrance of the estate. I sat miles away in the secure off-site surveillance hub, flanked by Desmond's elite private security contractors, watching the high-definition monitors. My family poured out of the van like common thieves under the cover of twilight. Roland, Valerie, Chloe, and Andre moved with frantic, paranoid energy. They wore dark, inconspicuous clothing, a sharp contrast to the designer labels they had paraded around the country club just hours earlier. Roland approached the reinforced steel service door, holding a sophisticated electronic lock-picking device. It took him less than 3 minutes to bypass the exterior keypad. He grinned, mistaking his minor victory for control, completely unaware that I had intentionally disabled the secondary firewall to let them inside. The heavy door swung open, and my family crept into my home. The infrared cameras captured every desperate movement as they navigated the dimly lit service corridors. They marched straight toward the grand parlor and the formal dining room. My grandfather had spent decades carefully curating one of the most prolific collections of Black art in the American South. Breathtaking canvases by Romare Bearden and striking visceral works by Jean-Michel Basquiat lined the mahogany-paneled walls. It was a cultural treasure trove meant to be preserved for generations. Watching my parents treat these priceless artifacts like cheap pawnshop inventory made my blood run entirely cold. Roland and Andre began frantically ripping the paintings off their secure mountings. Valerie, a woman who had spent her entire life pretending to be the epitome of grace and class, was eagerly helping them strip the walls bare. She wrapped the multi-million-dollar canvases in cheap protective foam, her hands moving with frantic greed. They leaned the masterpieces against the antique furniture, transforming the opulent living space into a sordid criminal bazaar. They did not care about the history or the legacy of the art. They only saw a lifeline to escape the federal prison sentences looming over their heads. The sheer disrespect was staggering, but I remained perfectly still in my leather chair at the security hub. I needed them to commit fully to the crime. I needed the felony to cross the point of no return. As Roland and Valerie continued dismantling the parlor, my older sister Chloe wandered into the frame of a different surveillance camera. Chloe had slipped away from the heavy lifting downstairs and crept up the sweeping grand staircase. She moved directly into the master suite, her eyes scanning the luxurious room with envious entitlement. She knew exactly what she was looking for. My grandfather had a hidden wall safe tucked behind a heavy oil portrait in the master dressing room. I watched the monitor in absolute disgust as Chloe pulled a specialized high-powered drill tool from her bag. Andre had clearly provided her with the industrial equipment to breach the safe. She pressed the drill against the locking mechanism, her face twisted in a mask of greedy determination. Metal sparked and whined until the heavy locking pins finally gave way. Chloe ripped the safe door open and reached inside, pulling out a heavy, dark velvet box. It contained our late grandmother's legendary diamond necklace. The bespoke, multi-million-dollar piece of jewelry had been in our family for decades, a symbol of my grandfather's enduring love for his wife. Chloe did not carefully place the necklace into her bag to sell later. Her vanity and extreme narcissism completely overrode her survival instincts. She unclasped the heavy diamond piece and brazenly fastened it around her own neck. She stood in front of the antique vanity mirror, admiring her reflection turning side to side as the diamonds caught the ambient light. She was parading around my home, wearing stolen jewels, entirely convinced she had successfully conquered my kingdom. She touched the stones with a smug, satisfied smile, pretending the wealth actually belonged to her. Her delusion was absolute. She walked back out into the hallway, proudly displaying the stolen necklace, oblivious to the high-definition lens recording her grand larceny from the corner of the ceiling. At exactly 9 o'clock, the buyers began to arrive. They slipped through the compromised service door, escorted into the grand parlor by a heavily perspiring Andre. There were 5 men in total, all wearing sharp, expensive suits that completely failed to hide their dangerous, predatory demeanors. These were not art enthusiasts or museum curators. They were ruthless opportunists from the international black market men who specialized in liquidating stolen assets for anonymous clients. One man, a notorious Russian oligarch known to global authorities for massive money laundering operations, immediately gravitated toward the Basquiat pieces. Another buyer, a shadowy tech billionaire with a reputation for purchasing stolen artifacts, pulled out a jeweler's loupe and began aggressively examining the Romare Bearden canvases. The grand parlor of Legacy Manor had officially become an active crime scene. Roland stood in the center of the room, acting as the frantic, unhinged auctioneer. The audio feed from my hidden microphones picked up every single hushed, tense negotiation. Roland was sweating profusely, his voice sharp and incredibly desperate. He offered the entire $15 million collection for a flat, non-negotiable fee of $5 million in untraceable cryptocurrency and immediate offshore wire transfers. He explained they needed the cash instantly to secure private transport out of the country before dawn. The Russian buyer smirked easily, recognizing Roland's absolute desperation. He knew Roland was a cornered animal with a rapidly ticking clock. The buyer slowly circled the room, tapping his expensive silver-tipped cane against the hardwood floor. He looked at the frantic faces of my family and calmly offered $4 million for the entire lot. Roland's face turned a violent, terrifying shade of crimson. He began to argue furiously, citing the authenticated auction value of the individual pieces. He pleaded that $4 million was an insulting fraction of their true worth. But Andre stepped forward and grabbed Roland tightly by the shoulder. His grip was punishingly firm. Andre hissed through clenched teeth that they did not have time to haggle over market value. He warned Roland that federal agents could show up at the estate at any second, and they desperately needed the exit capital right now. I sat in the security hub watching the criminal transaction unfold in perfect clarity. The security contractors beside me shifted uncomfortably in their seats, waiting for my command to call the authorities. I raised my hand, signaling them to hold their positions. We needed the financial transaction to completely cross the point of no return. We needed the felony wire fraud to be fully executed and digitally cemented in the banking system. Andre turned his attention back to the silent Russian buyer. He extended his hand, his face a mask of sweaty, terrified relief. "We accept the offer," Andre said, his voice echoing clearly through my earpiece. $5 million right now. Wire the required funds to the offshore account immediately, and you can load the canvases into your transport vehicles. The notoriously ruthless Russian black market buyer looked at them and nodded slowly. He pulled out an expensive encrypted satellite phone and typed a rapid series of digital commands. Less than 1 minute later, Andre's phone buzzed with an alert. Andre pulled the device from his pocket, his eyes widening as he read the glowing notification. The illicit $5 million digital transfer had successfully cleared the massive international banking firewall. They thought they had finally won. But they were wrong. Suddenly, the heavy steel security shutters of the entire Legacy Manor forcefully slammed down over every single exterior door and glass window in the estate. The house went into complete lockdown. The resounding crash of the ballistic steel shutters hitting the marble windowsills echoed through the grand foyer like a thunderclap. The vibration shook the floorboards, rattling the heavy antique chandeliers overhead. In an instant, Legacy Manor transformed from an opulent, sprawling estate into an impenetrable, airtight fortress. The heavy mahogany front doors were swallowed by thick titanium barriers. The secondary exits, the service corridors, and the grand French doors leading to the gardens were simultaneously sealed shut by the automated defense system. The deafening blare of the security siren shrieked through the house for 5 agonizing seconds before abruptly cutting off, leaving behind a ringing, terrified silence. Total absolute panic immediately consumed the room. The 5 international black market buyers, seasoned criminals who survived by anticipating traps, reacted with lethal speed. The Russian oligarch dropped his silver-tipped cane and instantly drew a sleek, suppressed firearm from his tailored jacket. The tech billionaire and the other 3 buyers followed suit, unholstering concealed weapons and sweeping the room with hardened, predatory eyes. They backed themselves against the center island of the grand parlor, forming a defensive perimeter. They recognized a tactical ambush when they saw one. My family devolved into instant, pathetic hysteria. Valerie shrieked, dropping the protective foam she had been using to wrap a priceless painting. She covered her ears and backed against the wall, her eyes darting frantically around the sealed room. Chloe, still wearing our late grandmother's stolen diamond necklace, collapsed onto the bottom step of the grand staircase. She pulled her knees to her chest and began sobbing uncontrollably. Her arrogant facade completely shattered by the reality of being trapped in a steel cage with armed, dangerous men. Roland and Andre stood frozen in the center of the foyer, their faces completely drained of blood. Roland frantically pushed the buttons on his electronic lock-picking device, but the remote access panel beside the front door had gone entirely dead. The system was mechanically locked from the inside. There was no keypad to hack. There was no handle to turn. They were buried alive in the very house they had come to pillage. Andre lunged toward the reinforced steel shutters covering the parlor windows. He slammed his fists against the cold, unyielding metal, screaming for someone to open the doors. He kicked the steel plate with his heavy boots, but the barrier did not even vibrate. He turned back to the room, his breath coming in ragged, panicked gasps. He looked at Roland, expecting the patriarch to have a solution, but Roland was staring blankly at his useless hacking tool, his mind completely incapable of processing the catastrophic failure of his master plan. Then the lighting system shifted. The brilliant, warm glow of the crystal chandeliers slowly dimmed until the grand foyer was plunged into heavy strategic darkness. The only illumination came from the faint blue emergency lights embedded in the baseboards. The shadows grew long and menacing. The armed buyers tightened their grips on their weapons, aiming their barrels into the dark corners of the expansive room. Valerie let out another piercing scream, burying her face in Roland's chest. High above them on the second floor, a single blinding white spotlight snapped on. The intense beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the grand Juliet balcony that overlooked the massive foyer. I stepped out from the shadows and walked slowly to the edge of the carved mahogany railing. I did not look like the terrified, mentally unstable victim they had described in their fraudulent court petitions. I wore an impeccably tailored, razor-sharp crimson power suit, my hair pulled back into a sleek, flawless style. My posture was rigid and commanding. I looked down at the chaotic, pathetic scene unfolding in my home, with the detached, analytical gaze of an apex predator inspecting its trapped prey. I was not alone. Stepping out of the darkness to flank me were 4 massive, heavily armed private security contractors. They wore tactical vests, their faces obscured by dark balaclavas, and they held high-powered rifles aimed directly down at the floor below. The laser sights from their weapons painted tiny glowing red dots across the chests of the Russian oligarch and his associates. The message was instantly clear. This was not a negotiation. This was an execution, and I was the one holding the gavel. Roland looked up at the balcony, his eyes wide with absolute, unadulterated shock. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words died in his throat. He had spent the entire day convincing his criminal associates that I was locked in a psychiatric ward or hiding in a lawyer's office. Seeing me standing above him, surrounded by a private army, completely broke his mind. Chloe stopped sobbing and stared up at me, her hands instinctively clutching the stolen diamonds around her neck. Valerie gasped, stepping back from Roland and pointing a trembling finger up at the balcony. "You are supposed to be at the hospital!" Valerie cried out, her voice cracking with hysteria. "We filed the papers. We filed the petition." I rested my hands on the cool mahogany railing and stared down at the woman who had birthed me. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell. I simply leaned toward a small, sleek microphone positioned on the balcony rail. My voice amplified through the hidden surround sound speakers embedded in the foyer walls, echoing with crystal-clear, terrifying authority. "You filed perjury." I corrected my tone devoid of any emotion. "And the judge dismissed it 10 hours ago. You thought you could lock me in a cage to steal my grandfather's legacy. But you forgot one crucial detail, Mother. I am the architect of this estate. I control the blueprints, and I am the one who locks the doors." I pressed a button on the remote control resting in my palm. The massive blank walls of the grand foyer, the exact walls my family had just stripped of their priceless artwork, suddenly transformed into massive projection screens. High-definition laser projectors hidden in the ceiling roared to life, casting blindingly bright 10-foot-tall images across the room. The first image to illuminate the walls was a scanned page directly from Grandfather Isaiah's Black Book. It was Roland's embezzlement ledger. The red ink was magnified for everyone in the room to read. The projection highlighted the exact dates, the routing numbers, and the specific amounts of money Roland had stolen from the Piedmont Heritage Country Club Youth Scholarship Fund. It showed the fraudulent wire transfers, moving money from disadvantaged children straight into Andre's offshore gambling accounts. Roland staggered backward as if he had been physically struck. He stared at his own financial crimes plastered across my living room wall in glowing, undeniable high definition. He tried to shield his face from the blinding light of the projector, but there was nowhere to hide. The Russian buyer looked at the ledger on the wall, his eyes narrowing as he realized the man who had just sold him $15 million of art was a desperate, collapsing fraud. I pressed the button again. The projection shifted. The walls were now covered with Andre's illicit gambling ledgers. The screens displayed the massive outstanding markers he owed to the violent sports betting syndicates. It showed the desperate, pathetic text messages he had sent to his bookies begging for more time, promising that his wealthy father-in-law would bail him out. The projection explicitly detailed how deeply underwater Andre truly was, proving to the black market buyers in the room that they were dealing with a man who possessed zero actual equity. Andre's face drained of all color. He looked up at the balcony, his eyes pleading, but I offered him no mercy. I pressed the final button on the remote. The visual projections faded slightly, replaced by a crisp, high-fidelity audio file. The sound of Andre's own voice filled the massive foyer, echoing off the marble floors and the vaulted ceilings. It was the recording I had captured on my smartwatch during the midnight siege. "Sign the house over to Roland right now." Andre's recorded voice growled menacingly through the speakers. "I will wire $1 million into your account by tomorrow morning. You take the money, you walk away, and you live a nice, quiet life. But if you do not sign it, Nia, I swear to God you do not make it out of this kitchen." The death threat hung heavily in the air, a chilling confirmation of his violent, predatory nature. Valerie covered her mouth in horror, finally understanding the true extent of the monster her golden child had married. Chloe stared at her husband in absolute shock, her carefully constructed reality shattering into a million irreparable pieces. Roland looked at Andre with profound disgust, realizing the son-in-law he had bankrupted himself to protect had just handed me the key to their federal indictments on a silver platter. The atmosphere in the room violently shifted. The international buyers were seasoned predators, and they instantly recognized the scent of a trap. They had been lured into a highly compromised location by desperate broke and legally radioactive amateurs. This was not a discreet whisper auction. This was a brilliantly orchestrated sting operation, and they were caught right in the crossfire. The Russian oligarch stepped forward, his custom firearm now aimed directly at Roland's chest. His face was a mask of cold, lethal fury. The other buyers fanned out, raising their weapons and surrounding my terrified family. Chloe screamed, throwing her hands over her head and curling into a tight ball on the stairs. Valerie dropped to her knees, openly sobbing and pleading with the armed men not to hurt them. Andre backed against the wall, holding his hands up in surrender, completely stripped of his arrogant bravado. "You lied to us," the Russian buyer stated, his thick accent dripping with lethal intent. He pressed the barrel of his weapon against Roland's tailored suit jacket. "You brought us into a compromised location. You are under federal investigation. You are completely bankrupt. You do not own this art. I can fix this." Roland stammered, his voice cracking with sheer pathetic terror. He raised his hands, shaking violently. "Please, just calm down. The money is safe. The $5 million is in the account. You wired it to me. I will send it right back. I will refund the transaction right now. Just put the gun down and you can all leave safely. I swear to you, I have your money." Roland frantically pulled his cell phone from his pocket. He tapped the screen, trying to open the offshore banking application to reverse the wire transfer. He was sweating profusely, his fingers fumbling over the glass screen. He just needed to send the funds back to the Russians to save his own life. I leaned forward over the mahogany railing, looking down at my father as he frantically tried to access his salvation. I took a slow, deep breath, savoring the absolute devastating finality of the moment. I leaned into the microphone. "You cannot refund the transaction," Roland I announced, my voice slicing through the chaos in the room with icy, terrifying precision. Roland froze. He looked up at the balcony, his phone trembling in his hand. The Russian oligarch kept his weapon firmly pressed against my father's chest, but he tilted his head, listening closely to my words. "The $5 million you demanded for my grandfather's art collection did not go into your offshore account." I continued, my gaze locking entirely onto the Russian buyer. "The routing numbers Roland provided for the wire transfer were intercepted and diverted. The accounts you wired your money to do not belong to Roland. They belong to my anonymous LLC." The Russian buyer's eyes widened in profound, dangerous realization. He looked back at Roland, his expression shifting from anger to absolute murderous intent. Roland frantically refreshed his banking app, the color completely leaving his face as the screen confirmed a zero balance. He had no money, he had no art, he had absolutely nothing to negotiate with. I straightened my posture, smoothing the lapels of my crimson suit, and delivered the final crushing blow to the room below. "The money is legally mine now," I stated, my voice echoing like a judge delivering a fatal sentence. "You have purchased nothing. You own nothing. And every single one of you is currently trespassing on my property." The foyer erupted into absolute pandemonium. The Russian oligarch lowered his weapon from Roland's chest and aimed it directly up at the Juliet balcony. My security contractors did not flinch. They simultaneously racked the slides of their high-powered rifles. The sharp mechanical clacks echoed through the grand space, a lethal symphony that instantly neutralized the oligarch's bravado. He was a ruthless criminal, but he was also a businessman who understood overwhelming tactical disadvantage. He slowly lowered his firearm, his cold eyes calculating the sheer impossibility of shooting his way out of a fortified bunker surrounded by an elite private army. The other black market buyers mirrored his surrender, holstering their weapons with frustrated, aggressive movements. They realized that Roland was not the mastermind, he was just the bait. I leaned into the microphone again. My voice was a cool, steady stream of logic cutting through the humid, terrified air of the foyer. I told them they had exactly one window of opportunity to leave Legacy Manor without federal interference. The $5 million they wired was gone, swallowed by an anonymous offshore entity completely disconnected from this physical location. They could choose to stay and attempt to extract their funds from a bankrupt, desperate man who possessed absolutely nothing, which would inevitably result in their arrest when the authorities arrived. Or they could cut their losses, walk out the side door, and disappear into the Atlanta night as free men. The choice was entirely theirs, but they only had 30 seconds to make it. The Russian oligarch looked at Roland with profound, unadulterated disgust. He spat a curse in his native language, turning his back on my father. He nodded sharply to his associates. I gave the signal to my lead security contractor. The heavy titanium door unsealed with a sharp pneumatic hiss grinding against the marble track. The buyers did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. They sprinted toward the narrow exit, their expensive leather shoes slipping and sliding frantically on the highly polished marble floors. The tech billionaire tripped heavily over a discarded piece of protective foam, tearing his custom suit trousers. But he scrambled to his feet like a terrified animal, desperate to escape the impending legal apocalypse. They shoved aggressively past one another, cursing in multiple languages, squeezing through the narrow service door, and completely disappearing into the dense, suffocating darkness of the sprawling estate grounds. The moment their shadows vanished into the night, I signaled my team again. The second the last buyer cleared the threshold, the service door slammed shut. The steel shutters violently crashed back down, sealing the perimeter once more. The heavy, suffocating silence returned to the grand foyer, broken only by the ragged, pathetic sobbing of my mother and sister. The reality of their isolation settled over them like a thick, suffocating lead blanket. The dangerous international criminals were gone, but the true ultimate predator remained securely inside the walls. They were completely and utterly alone in an impenetrable soundproof fortress, with the exact daughter they had spent a lifetime systematically destroying. There would be no high society friends to bail them out. There were no corrupt police contacts to call. They were totally trapped. Roland stared at the spot where the Russian oligarch had been standing. His chest heaved with violent, erratic breaths that sounded wet and shallow in the quiet room. His bespoke tailored suit was completely soaked through with fearful, sour perspiration clinging to his shaking frame. He ran a trembling hand over his balding head, his mind violently short-circuiting as the absolute magnitude of his failure finally registered in his corrupt brain. He had lost the art. He had lost the $5 million. He had lost his country club standing. He had lost everything. He whipped his head around, his eyes locking onto me as I stood on the balcony. The panic in his eyes instantly morphed into a feral, desperate rage. He marched toward the base of the grand staircase, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned stark white. He looked up at me, his face a contorted mask of furious entitlement. "You cannot do this to us!" Roland screamed, his voice cracking under the intense strain. "You open these doors right now! You give me that money back. You cannot kick us out. We are your family. We gave you life. We will absolutely ruin you for this." His threats were empty, hollow echoes bouncing off the high ceilings. I did not respond through the microphone. I reached over and switched the audio system off. The time for broadcasting was over. It was time to deal with them face to face. I stepped away from the mahogany railing and walked toward the top of the grand staircase. My private security detail parted seamlessly, allowing me to pass. I descended the sweeping carpeted steps with slow, deliberate precision. Each sharp click of my crimson heels felt like a heavy iron metronome slowly and rhythmically ticking down the final miserable seconds of their affluent existence. I did not rush my descent. I wanted them to feel the agonizing, crushing weight of my physical approach. I wanted them to watch the woman they called a failure systematically dismantle their kingdom. I wanted them to fully understand that the power dynamic had not just shifted in my favor. It had been entirely irreversibly obliterated. I reached the landing and stepped onto the marble floor of the foyer. The physical distance between us was gone. I stood mere feet away from the people who had terrorized my childhood and attempted to steal my future. Valerie cowered pathetically behind Roland's broad shoulders, her manicured hands covering her tear-stained face in a desperate attempt to hide from reality. Chloe remained crumpled defensively on the bottom step, too paralyzed by sheer, unadulterated shock to even lift her head to look at me. Andre was pressed hard against the decorative wallpaper near the parlor doors, sweating profusely, looking exactly like a guilty man, nervously waiting for a firing squad to assemble. I looked Roland dead in the eye. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with a quiet, lethal calm that forced him to lean in to hear his own destruction. "I am not keeping your $5 million, I stated plainly. I watched a brief, pathetic flicker of hope ignite in his eyes, assuming I was going to wire the funds back to the Russians and save him from their wrath. I let him hold on to that hope for 3 seconds before I crushed it. The $5 million was already routed to a secure trust dedicated to compensating the victims of your massive decade-long financial embezzlement scheme. The money is gone, Roland. You are completely bankrupt." Roland gasped, staggering backward as if the floor had dropped out from underneath him. He shook his head violently in denial. "You do not know what you are talking about," he stammered, his voice weak and trembling. "There is no embezzlement scheme. You are making this up." I reached into the sleek leather portfolio tucked under my arm. I pulled out a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy premium paper. I did not hand them to him. I simply held them up, letting the dim emergency lighting illuminate the official county seals stamped across the top pages. "I know everything," I replied softly. "I know about the retirement funds you stole. I know about the youth scholarship money you funneled to offshore bookies, but most importantly, I know exactly how you paid for your opulent, fraudulent lifestyle." I took a slow step forward, forcing Roland to retreat. He bumped into Valerie, who let out a sharp, terrified whimper. I looked at my mother, then at my sister, ensuring they were paying absolute attention. "You thought I was a naive, easily manipulated target?" I continued. "You assumed I would cower in the dark and sign away a $40 million estate just to make the screaming stop. You underestimated my intelligence and you severely underestimated my capital. You see, while you were busy trying to break my walls and steal my grandfather's artwork, I was busy leveraging his hidden assets to execute a hostile takeover of your entire reality." I separated the thick stack of documents in my hands, slowly fanning them out like a deck of lethal playing cards. "These are not basic property appraisals or standard tax records," I explained, my tone surgical, cold, and devastatingly precise. "These are your primary corporate mortgages. These are your hidden secondary personal loans. These are the massive, over-leveraged home equity lines of credit that you desperately and illegally drained to pay off Andre's disgusting, violent gambling debts." Roland's terrified eyes darted wildly over the official documents. He instantly recognized the banking corporate logos. He recognized his own forged, completely fraudulent financial statements attached to the loan agreements. The realization of what I had done hit him with the force of a freight train. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. I did not wait for him to find his voice. I aggressively purchased the absolute ownership of your toxic liabilities from the panicking banks and the shady underworld creditors. I paid them off in clean cash, and they happily transferred the legal deeds of trust directly to my anonymous corporate shell company. I took one final, devastating step forward. I was so close I could smell the stale, sour scent of Roland's panicked sweat. I looked my parents dead in the eye, my gaze locking onto theirs with unyielding, absolute dominance. "I am not just kicking you out of my house," I stated, my voice echoing in the absolute stillness of the locked foyer. "I am kicking you out of yours." I slowly released my grip and dropped the heavy, damning stack of official legal foreclosure notices directly at their trembling feet. The thick papers slapped against the marble floor, scattering around their expensive designer shoes. "You missed 3 consecutive payments on your primary mortgage," I continued, mercilessly detailing their ruin. "The acceleration clauses in your loan agreements allowed me as your primary creditor to demand immediate payment in full. Since you possess 0 liquid assets and 0 equity, I initiated instant asset seizure this morning. Your magnificent $5 million estate officially belongs to me now. You have absolutely nothing left to your names." The absolute sheer crushing gravity of my words struck them like a physical blow. Roland stared at the foreclosure notices scattered across the polished marble floor. Now he was looking at the undeniable proof of his total ruin. His knees buckled slightly and he leaned heavily against the mahogany banister for support. Valerie's reaction was entirely different. She let out a guttural, agonizing wail that echoed through the grand foyer. She collapsed onto the cold marble floor, her designer dress pooling around her trembling legs. She crawled forward on her hands and knees, reaching desperately for the hem of my crimson trousers. "Nia, please." Valerie sobbed, tears ruining her immaculate perfect makeup. "You cannot do this to us. We are your family. I am your mother. We can fix this. Just give us the house back." I stepped back, pulling my pant leg out of her desperate grasp. "You stopped being my mother the moment you chose to protect a degenerate gambler over your own flesh and blood," I replied. "You do not get to play the family card only when you are entirely out of options and facing federal prison. You made your choices, Valerie. Now you get to live with the devastating consequences." While Valerie was crying on the floor, I noticed a sudden frantic movement. My older sister Chloe had realized the ship was rapidly sinking. She decided to abandon her parents and her husband to save herself. Chloe crept away from the bottom of the staircase, moving with desperate stealth toward the rear service corridor. She still wore our late grandmother's multi-million-dollar diamond necklace. She clutched her expensive designer handbag tightly against her chest, her eyes darting frantically toward the back exit. She intended to slip out the side door and disappear into the night with the stolen jewels before anyone realized she was missing. She severely underestimated my surveillance capabilities. I simply raised my right hand and pointed a single finger directly at the shadowy corridor. "Stop her," I commanded. Two of my massive private security contractors immediately broke formation. They moved with terrifying precision, intercepting Chloe before she could even reach the handle of the service door. They stepped directly into her path, crossing their high-powered rifles to form an impenetrable physical barrier. Chloe slammed into their tactical vests, bouncing back with a sharp gasp of sheer terror. She spun around looking desperately for another exit, but she was completely boxed in. I walked slowly toward the corridor. Chloe pressed her back against the wall, her chest heaving with frantic breaths. "Let me go!" "Nia?" Chloe demanded, her voice shrill and trembling with fear. "This is between you and Dad. Let me walk out of here right now." I stopped just a few feet away from her, silently studying her pathetic attempt to shift the massive blame entirely onto our failing father. "You are not going anywhere, Chloe," I stated firmly. "Take off Grandmother's diamond necklace right now. It does not belong to you." Chloe's hands instinctively flew to her throat, her fingers wrapping fiercely around the heavy platinum setting. Her eyes widened in absolute stubborn defiance. "No!" Chloe screamed, her voice echoing shrilly in the confined space of the corridor. "Grandpa promised this to me. It is mine. You already took the mansion. You cannot take my jewelry too. I am not giving it to you. You broke into a secure safe using an industrial drill to steal that piece of jewelry," I corrected her. "Grandfather left you a minor collection of pearls in his will. That diamond necklace belongs to the estate trust. As the sole trustee, I am ordering you to take it off and hand it over immediately." Chloe shook her head violently, her perfectly styled hair falling in messy strands across her tear-stained face. "I will not do it," she shrieked, pressing her back harder against the wall. "It is my birthright. It belongs to me." Before I could instruct the security team to physically remove the stolen diamonds from her neck, a deep, commanding voice resonated from the dark shadows near the Grand Library doors. "Actually, Chloe, the legal reality of your situation is far more severe than you seem to comprehend." Desmond stepped out of the shadows, adjusting his tailored suit jacket with meticulous precision. He walked toward us, his expression a mask of pure, unadulterated legal menace. My parents gasped, realizing that my highly aggressive, fiercely loyal trust attorney had been inside the locked mansion the entire time. Desmond stopped beside me, looking down at Chloe with an expression of profound professional disgust. Removing that necklace from the premises of Legacy Manor without the explicit written authorization of the estate trustee constitutes a direct act of grand larceny. Desmond informed her, his voice slicing through her arrogant delusions like a scalpel. The appraised value of those diamonds exceeds $2 million. Under Georgia state law, stealing an asset of that magnitude is a major felony. It carries a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 to 15 years in a federal penitentiary. Chloe stared at Desmond, her mouth falling open in sheer paralyzed horror. The reality of federal prison finally pierced through her thick armor of entitlement. If you attempt to walk out that door with that necklace, Desmond continued, his tone absolutely lethal, I will personally ensure that you are prosecuted to the absolute fullest extent of the law. You will serve hard time. Take the necklace off, Chloe. Do it right now. The psychological defeat was instantaneous and completely devastating. She realized she had absolutely no leverage, no money, and no allies left to protect her. Her hands trembled violently as she reached behind her neck. Her fingers fumbled awkwardly with the intricate platinum clasp. She sobbed a pathetic broken sound that echoed loudly in the quiet corridor. The heavy clasp finally gave way. Chloe pulled the brilliant diamond necklace away from her throat, her face flushed dark crimson with absolute unbearable humiliation. She held the diamonds out to me, her hands shaking so badly the jewels rattled against each other. I did not reach out to take them. I simply nodded to Desmond. He pulled a pair of white archival gloves from his pocket, slipped them on, and carefully took the multi-million-dollar necklace from her trembling grasp. He placed the jewelry securely into an evidence bag, ensuring the asset was fully protected. Chloe collapsed against the wall, sliding down to the marble floor, weeping loudly into her hands. She had been completely stripped of her golden child status, her stolen wealth, and her arrogant pride. She was nothing more than a broke, desperate woman facing the catastrophic consequences of her own immense greed. I turned away from my sobbing sister and walked back into the center of the grand foyer. Valerie was still crying on the floor near the foreclosure notices. Roland was leaning against the staircase, staring blankly at the projected ledgers on the walls, completely unresponsive to the world around him. But there was one predator left in the room who had not yet been fully neutralized. Andre had watched the entire exchange from his corner near the parlor doors. He knew that the massive illegal gambling debts he owed were now fully owned by my anonymous corporation. He had absolutely no money, no leverage, and no escape route. The crushing realization that his entire life was over finally snapped his fragile, desperate mind. Andre let out a furious, guttural roar, his eyes dilated with pure adrenaline-fueled madness. He abandoned all logic and reason. He blamed me entirely for his catastrophic downfall. He decided in that split second that if he was going to lose everything, he was going to take me down with him. He pushed off the wall and charged directly across the grand foyer. His heavy boots pounded violently against the marble floor. He lowered his shoulder, aiming his massive physical bulk straight at me in a final desperate act of violence. My private security contractors immediately shouted commands, raising their rifles to intercept the sudden threat. Desmond stepped forward to shield me, but I did not flinch. I stood my ground, my eyes locked onto Andre as he sprinted furiously across the room. He closed the distance rapidly, his face twisted into a terrifying mask of violent rage. He was less than 10 feet away. He reached his hands out, his fingers curling into tight, aggressive fists. He prepared to launch his heavy body directly into mine. Right before he could close the final distance, a sudden, massive, deafening explosion of sound completely shattered the chaotic tension in the room. The heavy titanium security barricades covering the front entrance of Legacy Manor were violently bypassed and destroyed from the exterior. The massive solid mahogany front doors were forcefully kicked open from the outside, crashing heavily against the interior marble walls with an earth-shattering impact that stopped Andre dead in his tracks. A heavily armored tactical team from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, flanked by specialized units from the Atlanta Police Department, poured through the shattered entrance of Legacy Manor. They moved with an absolute terrifying precision that completely overwhelmed the space. Blinding beams from high-powered tactical flashlights sliced through the dim, crimson emergency lighting, aggressively sweeping across the grand marble foyer. The booming, authoritative voices of federal agents commanded everyone to get down on the ground immediately. The sheer physical force and chaotic noise of the breach instantly neutralized the violent, murderous trajectory Andre had been on. He froze completely, his aggressive forward momentum entirely arrested by the sudden, shocking appearance of a dozen assault rifles aimed directly at his chest. The predator had instantly become the prey caught perfectly in the crosshairs of a federal strike team. Andre raised his hands, the color rapidly draining from his face, as whatever adrenaline had fueled his desperate charge completely evaporated. Surrendering, however, was not enough to spare him from the severe physical consequences of his violent actions. Two heavily armored federal agents closed the distance between them in a fraction of a second. They grabbed Andre violently by the shoulders of his designer leather jacket and forcefully swept his heavy boots out from under him. Andre hit the polished marble floor with a sickening heavy thud that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. The agents aggressively drove their knees into his back, forcefully pinning him down, while they wrenched his arms behind him. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs snapping tightly shut sounded like the final undeniable nail in his coffin. The lead FBI agent crouched over Andre, pressing his weight into my brother-in-law's spine while loudly reading him his rights. The agent listed the catastrophic charges with clinical, devastating accuracy: interstate wire fraud, illegal offshore sports gambling, racketeering, felony extortion. Each federal charge carried decades in a maximum security penitentiary. Andre pressed his face against the cold marble floor, gasping for air, completely stripped of his arrogant bravado and flashy sports agent persona. He was nothing more than a ruined, bankrupt criminal facing the absolute destruction of his entire life. Desmond stood calmly by my side on the grand staircase, completely unbothered by the heavily armed tactical teams swarming my living room. He adjusted the cuffs of his immaculate tailored suit jacket and looked down at my ruined family with an expression of profound professional satisfaction. Desmond explained to the room that exactly 48 hours ago he had walked directly into the federal building in downtown Atlanta and handed the original authenticated black book directly over to the authorities. The federal agents had spent the last 2 days meticulously verifying every single fraudulent transaction, every forged document, and every illegal wire transfer my father had ever executed. The authorities had been waiting outside my gates all evening. Desmond continued, his voice slicing through the chaotic noise of the foyer. They were simply waiting for Roland and Andre to finalize the illicit wire transfer with the black market Russian buyers. The moment that $5 million cleared the international banking firewall, it legally triggered federal jurisdiction. It was the final, undeniable piece of digital evidence they needed to secure the arrest warrants for interstate financial crimes. My family had dug their own graves, and the federal government had just arrived to bury them. The tactical agents quickly pivoted their intense attention toward my father. Roland had watched Andre get violently tackled to the floor, his corrupt mind entirely unable to process the total irreversible collapse of his carefully constructed kingdom. As two federal agents aggressively approached him, Roland desperately attempted to summon the polished, wealthy country club charm he had relied on his entire life to escape accountability. He raised his hands defensively, offering a pathetic, shaking smile to the arresting officers. He frantically insisted there had been a terrible misunderstanding, claiming he was a highly respected financial advisor and a crucial pillar of the Atlanta business community. He begged them to understand that this was simply a private family dispute over an inheritance. The federal agents did not care about his tailored Italian suit, his country club memberships, or his fabricated social status. They grabbed my father aggressively by the lapels of his jacket, spun him around without an ounce of hesitation, and slammed him hard against the intricate mahogany paneling he had tried to demolish just days earlier. The impact knocked the wind completely out of Roland's lungs. The agents kicked his legs apart and wrenched his wrists behind his back, securing them with heavy steel cuffs. Roland whimpered a pathetic broken sound that completely shattered the imposing patriarch image he had forced me to worship my entire childhood. As the cold steel snapped tightly around Roland's wrists, my mother completely lost her mind. Valerie had spent decades meticulously cultivating an image of flawless, untouchable high society grace. She had sacrificed her own daughter to maintain the illusion of black elite supremacy. Now, watching her husband being treated like a common street criminal, she devolved into absolute primitive hysteria. Valerie scrambled across the marble floor on her hands and knees, screaming frantically at the federal agents. She grabbed at the heavy tactical vests of the arresting officers, desperately demanding they unhand her husband immediately. Valerie shrieked that the police were making a catastrophic mistake, that Roland was an incredibly important man, and that they were unfairly ruining a prominent family. The lead agent ignored her theatrical, desperate sobbing entirely. He stood squarely in front of my father and began reciting the Miranda rights in a loud, commanding voice. Over Valerie's piercing, agonizing screams, the agent listed Roland's catastrophic federal offenses: massive financial embezzlement, corporate wire fraud, grand larceny, conspiracy to commit international money laundering. The sheer volume and severity of the federal charges guaranteed my father would never see the outside of a prison cell for the rest of his natural life. While Valerie shrieked and Roland was pressed helplessly against the wall, my sister Chloe remained completely paralyzed on the bottom step of the grand staircase. The violent tactical raid had entirely broken whatever fragile, delusional grip she still maintained on reality. Chloe was hyperventilating wildly, her chest heaving as she gasped desperately for oxygen that her panic-stricken lungs simply could not process. Her shaking hands clawed frantically at her own throat, subconsciously searching for the heavy multi-million-dollar diamond necklace she had been forced to surrender to Desmond just minutes prior. Her neck was completely bare. Her bank accounts were entirely empty. Her husband was lying face down on the marble floor in handcuffs destined for federal prison. The undisputed golden child of the family had been brutally, systematically stripped of her false throne. Chloe was no longer the pampered, arrogant princess of the Atlanta elite. She was the totally destitute, humiliated wife of a convicted felon, facing a bleak lifetime of public disgrace and grinding inescapable poverty. She rocked back and forth on the stairs, sobbing uncontrollably as the flashing red and blue police lights washed over her ruined designer dress. The tactical team officially secured the perimeter of the estate and began the process of physically hauling the prisoners out of the mansion. Andre was dragged roughly up from the marble floor, his designer clothes scuffed, torn, and completely ruined by the takedown. He kept his head hung low, refusing to look up at the balcony as the armed federal agents marched him out into the chaotic sea of flashing lights and police cruisers waiting in the circular driveway. The heavy steel front doors remained wide open, letting the cool spring night air flood into the suffocating, tense atmosphere of the foyer. Next, the agents moved to extract Roland. My father stumbled awkwardly as the officers pulled him away from the mahogany paneling. His expensive suit was torn at the shoulder, his tie was askew, and his posture was completely broken. The man who had spent his entire life projecting absolute power and control now looked small, weak, and remarkably old. The federal agents gripped his arms tightly, forcing him to walk toward the exit. He dragged his feet, his expensive leather shoes scuffing against the marble tiles he no longer owned. As the agents forcefully marched him toward the shattered front entrance, Roland stopped resisting the officers just long enough to turn his head. He looked up at the Juliet balcony, his bloodshot eyes finding mine through the dim, flashing emergency lights. The sheer, unadulterated hatred radiating from his gaze was intense enough to burn down the entire estate. He dug his heels into the marble floor, forcing the federal agents to aggressively drag him the last few remaining feet toward the door. He glared at me, his face twisting into a hideous mask of pure, venomous rage. "You are a monster," Roland spat out, his voice dripping with absolute malice and utter, devastating defeat. The words echoed loudly through the grand foyer, a final pathetic attempt to make me feel the shame and guilt he had weaponized against me my entire life. I did not flinch. I did not look away. I stood tall and unyielding on the balcony, smoothing the lapels of my crisp crimson suit. I felt the absolute, undeniable power of my grandfather's legacy coursing powerfully through my veins. The days of cowering before his emotional abuse were permanently over. I looked my father dead in the eye, my expression completely devoid of mercy, and delivered the final fatal blow to his entirely shattered ego. "I am exactly the woman grandfather raised me to be," I replied, my voice echoing coldly and decisively through the grand foyer. "I protect what is mine." The heavy titanium doors of Legacy Manor slid shut, sealing the chaotic wreckage of my former family securely on the outside. The flashing sirens faded into the distance, carrying away the architects of my lifelong torment. Silence returned to the grand foyer, wrapping around me like a protective cloak. I stood on the Juliet balcony, simply breathing in the clean air of my grandfather's fortress. The war was officially over. 6 months passed, bringing a permanent shift to Atlanta. The fallout was brutal. Society magazines that once plastered my parents on their glossy covers now dedicated their pages to their spectacular demise. I sat at the oak desk in the wine cellar reading the Atlanta Business Chronicle. The headline read, "Disgraced Financial Advisor Roland Sentenced to 15 Years in Federal Prison." The article detailed the collapse of his embezzlement empire. Roland attempted to use his political connections to secure a lenient sentence, but discovered loyalty in Buckhead is conditional upon wealth. Without his money, he was just another convicted felon. Andre managed to save himself by betraying the family that bankrupted themselves to protect him. When federal prosecutors offered a plea deal, Andre sang like a canary. He turned over all evidence regarding Roland's operations and my mother's complicity in the fraudulent loans. In exchange for his cooperation, Andre received a reduced sentence of 5 years in a minimum security facility. He traded his designer suits for a jumpsuit, abandoning Chloe to face the ruin alone. Valerie and Chloe were stripped of every luxury they had ever known. The bankruptcy courts seized their remaining assets, liquidating their wardrobes, imported cars, and jewelry collections to pay a fraction of the massive debts they owed. Atlanta society ruthlessly excommunicated them. The Jack and Jill chapters revoked their memberships. The country club board permanently banned them from the premises. Women who used to kiss my mother on both cheeks at charity luncheons now crossed the street to avoid making eye contact with her. Without Roland's stolen money, Valerie and Chloe relocated to a tiny apartment in a rundown complex on the outskirts of the city. The women who once sneered at my career were now facing the harsh reality of the working class. My security team reported Valerie had taken a minimum wage job working the perfume counter at a department store. She spent her days spraying sample fragrances for the exact same society wives she used to host at her lavish dinner parties, forced to smile while swallowing her absolute humiliation. Chloe worked the closing shift at a coffee shop wearing a stained apron instead of our grandmother's diamonds. They had nothing left but the bitter, crushing weight of their own consequences. Legacy Manor had been completely transformed. I did not just repair the damage Andre's thugs inflicted upon the historic plaster and mahogany paneling. I painstakingly restored the estate to its original glory, using my architectural expertise to highlight the rich Black history embedded in every room. The grand parlor, which had been the site of their desperate whisper auction, was now a breathtaking gallery showcasing my grandfather's magnificent $15 million art collection. The vibrant canvases of Romare Bearden and Jean-Michel Basquiat hung proudly on the walls, bathed in warm golden light. Tonight, the manor was alive with genuine purpose. I was hosting the inaugural gala for the Isaiah Heritage Foundation. Unlike the fake self-serving charity events my parents used to organize to stroke their own egos, this gala had a real tangible mission. We were raising millions of dollars to fully fund academic scholarships for brilliant young Black architects and historians, ensuring that our cultural legacy would be fiercely protected by the next generation. The grand foyer was filled with hundreds of distinguished guests, but the atmosphere was different from the toxic social climbing of my parents' era. These were passionate philanthropists, respected scholars, and genuine leaders who understood the profound value of community and heritage. Soft jazz played from a string quartet in the corner, mingling with the sounds of joyful laughter and meaningful conversation. I walked down the sweeping grand staircase, wearing a stunning emerald green evening gown that flowed elegantly behind me. I did not feel like an outcast or discarded scapegoat. I felt like the undisputed master of my own domain. Desmond stood near the stairs looking incredibly sharp in a classic black tuxedo. As I reached the marble floor, he offered a genuine smile and handed me a crystal flute filled with expensive vintage champagne. He nodded toward the center of the gallery, where a massive commissioned oil portrait of Grandfather Isaiah hung above the antique marble fireplace. In the painting, my grandfather was smiling, his eyes full of the same fierce, protective energy that now coursed through my own veins. I walked slowly toward the portrait, the gentle clinking of crystal and the warm hum of conversation fading into the background. I stood before the magnificent painting, feeling the immense, indestructible weight of the empire I had successfully defended. They had tried to break my mind, destroy my reputation, and steal my future. They threw me into the darkest depths of their greed, expecting me to quietly suffocate under the pressure. But they failed to realize that the intense pressure had only forged me into an unbreakable diamond. I looked at my grandfather's painted face and felt a profound, overwhelming sense of peace. I had not just survived my toxic family, I had systematically outsmarted, outmaneuvered, and conquered them. I raised my champagne glass toward the portrait in a silent, triumphant salute. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the crisp, sparkling wine, savoring the sweet, intoxicating taste of absolute victory. The heavy oak doors of Legacy Manor were securely locked, shielding the beautiful, thriving empire within. The legacy was finally safe. I lowered my glass, smiled at my grandfather, and let the brilliant golden lights of the gallery wash over me as the scene gently faded into perfect, quiet blackness.